Hey fearsome friends, I hope you are all well and staying safe. A big warm welcome to all my new subscribers and to my new channel member, Lightning T Bolt. Your extra support means the world to me. Tonight I bring to you some incredibly chilling stories about some of the unsavory characters among us, and I hope as always they can serve as a warning to be more vigilant in certain situations. So sit back, get cozy, comfy, warm, and remember, keep being creepy. This happened in August 2013. I was visiting Montreal for their diver site weekend, which was basically like Pride, but it took place on the long weekend before the official Montreal Pride. My best friend at the time had met a guy at the Toronto Pride a month earlier, and he'd invited both of us to come, so that my friend wouldn't be uncomfortable spending the weekend with someone he didn't know well. We arrived on a Thursday and the trip was going great. We went out on the first night, walking the streets, and the next day we saw the road being closed off to cars in preparation for the festival. That night our host made us a nice dinner and then we went out again. Just a quick note before I get into what happened. I partied quite a bit with drugs at this time, and I also in the past had a tendency to lose my cell phone. So for about a year prior to this, I stopped taking my cell phone out with me. So that Friday night we went out to a club, Parking, which sadly has since closed, and it was another fun night. The music was great and the tequila shots were incredibly cheap. I was dancing and moving all around the club, but would circle back and check in with my friends and our host, and I would also run into people that I knew who were also visiting from Toronto. I ended up taking some MDMA from one of them, danced some more until I was completely soaked in sweat, then I went to the bathroom to wipe myself down and pee. When I got into the bathroom there was someone leaving, and it looked like I was the only one in there from then on. Now I used the stall, because I have a hard time using the urinal, and when I came out I was quite surprised to see a man in the corner of the washroom smiling at me. He looked to be in his mid-30s, on the shorter side and a bit chubby. He was wearing a polo t-shirt and jeans and had glasses. I remember thinking when I saw him that he reminded me of an accountant, not sure why. I was pretty sure I hadn't heard the door, but I couldn't be sure, so I just smiled back and said hello as I went to wash my hands. "Hello," he responded. "Are you having fun tonight?" I replied that I was and that the music was incredible. I was wiping myself down with paper towels and my shirt. "Do you want to do some coke with me?" he asked. Now this was not the first time I had been offered coke in a bathroom at a nightclub. I had done this in the past and ended up having some good experiences and meeting some interesting people. I was already high and drunk and not thinking much of it, so I said, "Sure, I'd love to, thanks. I just live right near here. It's at my place if you don't mind coming over. We can do some lines and have a drink, then walk back to the club," he replied. Now obviously looking back, I realise how very dumb my following actions were, and I can't imagine myself being so stupid and careless now, but without thinking about it, I agreed and I left with him. We chatted on the walk over to his place. He asked me where I was from, because I didn't seem like I was from Montreal, what parties I had gone to, how old I was, and my name. I asked him his name, but he instead responded by saying we'd arrived. The whole walk felt like 5 minutes, but I honestly hadn't been paying much attention to where we were walking. His apartment was in a building that had 3 floors, and his unit was on the second. You had to climb this long, narrow metal staircase, and his door seemed to be in the middle of 2 other apartments on either side. He unlocked the door and let me in first, flicked on the lights, and told me to make myself comfortable. As I was walking in, I noticed that he had a carpet, so I turned around to ask him if I should take my shoes off. And that's when I noticed that he was locking the door from the inside, with a key above the regular lock. In that moment I was overwhelmed with a feeling of dread, like I have never felt before. The danger that I had possibly put myself in another city, no phone, nobody knows where I am, and now seeing this person locking their door from the inside with a key. I thought to myself that I'll just pretend I hadn't seen it. I won't take off my shoes and politely hang out for a few minutes, then ask to head back. I also thought I could be having an extreme overreaction to what I saw because I was so high. But as I looked around, everything inside of me was just screaming that I needed to get out of there. I walked over to the couch and sat on the arm, as he said I should take off my shoes and relax. I was getting a better look at him now in the lights of his apartment. He still looked plain and unassuming, but his eyes looked shifty, and he pulled down both of the shades on the windows that were on each side of the door. I told him that I was okay and I was eager to get back to dancing, so he said he would make us drinks, then we could go back. The apartment looked much bigger inside than it did from the street. It was an open layout with the living room besides the kitchen, and then a hallway in the middle with closed doors painted black, and I could hear music coming from one of the doors. I asked him if someone else was here as he came from the kitchen with a glass, and he said that there wasn't. As he handed me the glass, he looked me up and down. I wasn't wearing a shirt, and he said with this increasingly creepy smile spreading across his face, "You have a very beautiful body, especially your chest. Would you mind if I took some before photos of you before we went back?" Every alarm bell is going off in my head now, and all I can think about is Jeffrey Dahmer and all of his Polaroids. What am I going to do? Because that was such a creepy thing to have said. All I can manage is a polite, nervous laugh as I take the drink and say, "Sure." "Excellent," he says, then tells me to take off my shoes and finish my drink while he goes to get the Coke and his camera. He walked down the hall, took out his keys and unlocks the second door. He opens it enough to slip in and then closes it behind him. The second that door was closed, I jumped up, ran over to the sink, dumped my drink, put my shirt on, it had been tied around the belt loop of my shorts, and ran to the front door. I was able to turn and unlock the regular lock, but the door wouldn't budge. I kept turning and pulling, but nothing. Then I heard from behind me, "What are you doing?" I turned around and he was standing at the base of the hallway with one of those professional cameras slung around his neck and holding a square mirror with a pile of white powder on it. I thanked him for the drink, gesturing to my empty glass, but that it was getting late and I wanted to get back. I said we could exchange numbers and maybe meet up tomorrow. His demeanor changed slightly at this. He was still smiling, but his tone when he next spoke sounded irritated. He asked me if I was nervous about taking the photos and that I should just wait for my drink to relax me. I said no, and I wanted to go. This exchange of him telling me to stay and me saying no went back and forth for about a minute, when he then suddenly glared at me, put down the mirror, pointed at the couch and said, "Sit down now." Not knowing what to do or how I was going to get out of this, I remembered that there were other units on each side of us. It had to be around 2:30 in the morning at this point, so I just started screaming at the top of my lungs like a madman, banging on the door, the windows and the wall. "Shut up, be quiet," he snapped at me as he ran to the door. He quickly unlocked it, stepped aside and told me to get out. I bolted out that door and down the stairs, skipping the bottom steps, and hopped over the side of the railing. I looked up behind me once I'd landed, and he wasn't there, but I heard a door slam and took off running down the street. I hadn't paid much attention on the walk there, so I didn't know which way to go, but I knew it was close, and was luckily able to wave down a passing taxi and take it back to the bar. When I got back there, I found my friend in the same spot dancing. The whole incident must have only been less than half an hour. I was too embarrassed about how stupid I had been, and being back in the club I started to feel bad that I had just freaked out on this nice man, so I didn't say anything, but I stayed by his side until we left shortly after I'd got back. The entire thing felt quite surreal, and I remember the next day when I did tell my friend, I kinda laughed it off, joking about getting murdered. I tried to make light of it because it was so scary, and it wasn't until years later, after joining Reddit and this sub in particular, that I started to think about that night more and more, realizing how much potential danger I'd put myself in. Now, I work in a local mini-mart. It's a work environment where tobacco or alcohol is sold to your typical customers, the homeless, Karens, and disgusting drunks, and of course the perverted freaks. I normally work on the weekends, and this day in particular was a 12-hour shift. I have a co-worker who comes in the evening and closes up with me, and we'll call him Jack. So as the shift went on, I get the same locals as usual. This community is very small and diverse. Even the regulars and homeless will point out who's new in town. On the following Monday, I noticed a new face walk in. I gave my normal greeting as always, and I could tell that this man had been an inmate who was just released. He was about 5'10", bald, Latino, and the clothes he was wearing were gang-related. I normally don't like to stereotype gang members or people that dress in a similar way, as some of them genuinely don't cause any trouble, but throughout that whole week, he's been coming in to the store, so I assumed he was a new customer. But oh, was I wrong. Fast forward to Saturday. The man came in and I greeted him as usual. I noticed that he'd been coming in every day at a certain time, and the part that really made me feel uncomfortable was that every time I rang him up at the register, he would comment in Spanish and say, "Why is such a beautiful girl like you always alone?" A chill ran down my spine every time he would say that. Now, I'm the type of person who always thinks the worst. You can call me pessimistic or whatever, but fast forward to the last 10 minutes of my shift, and that's when things really got weird. The man again walked in and got his usual purchase. He looked at me and said, "It's time for you to go home, huh?" I awkwardly chuckled and told him to have a good night. I then locked the doors and called my co-worker Jack over. I set the store alarms, and as I'm leaving I grip my taser, which is also a baton, turn it on, and the whole time that I'm standing outside, I started to feel very unsettled. I noticed that there was an empty vehicle parked in reverse next to mine, and that's when I realized that it belongs to the creepy customer. Jack took longer than usual to lock the gate that night, which made me frantic. I was getting impatient, and I moved him out of the way so that I could lock the gate and glass door quickly. I then made a run for my car as fast as I could. I got in and locked my doors. I turned on the engine and headlights, switched the gear to drive, but I haven't pushed on the gas yet. Suddenly, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I turned around facing the rear passenger side to see the same creepy customer. He looked around and tried to open the vehicle parked next to mine. I got confused for a little bit, because on the cameras I had seen him drive that car. He then quickly goes over to my passenger side and tries to hastily open it. You would think I would be so scared that I'd scream, but instead I was outraged. I was so angry at this man for thinking I was an easy target. I waited for him to try again and pulled on my door handle. As soon as he reached out again, I put my car on sports mode and was ready to take off. He'd barely placed his hand on the handle when I stepped on the gas as hard as I could. I looked in my rearview mirror to see him getting dragged. He eventually let go and cusses out at me in Spanish. I was still in the parking lot, and I was ragged that I hadn't run him over. So I threw my gear into reverse and tried to hit him, and kept reversing until he ran onto the sidewalk. I then threw my car into drive and sped off. As I got to the freeway ramp, I could see him standing in the middle of the parking lot, giving me this sinister look I will never forget. For a bit of backstory, I was only about 15 or 16 when this happened, and my family had moved from Texas to Louisiana about a month before this strange occurrence. Now, I'm a very athletic person, but at the time I was quite small, at about 5'2" and very slim. Easy to get if someone wanted to get me, as my mother would say. On this particular day, I was out for a run, when a man came up to me. He was wearing sweatpants and a sweatshirt. This was odd to me because it was the middle of summer and it was very hot outside. I remember that I was wearing a tank top and shorts, and as he walked up to me, he gave me a really lopsided grin. I could see that half of his teeth were missing or bright yellow, and it was not a pretty sight. He looked to be in his mid-30s, and he ran over to me. Mind you, I was running on the side of a road, so he ran across the road just to talk to me. Red flags were going off in my head, but I didn't do anything for some reason. I simply took out my headphones and asked what he wanted or needed. He didn't respond for a minute, so I kept running, putting my headphones back in and turning my music back on. Then a few minutes later, the same guy runs past me and then waits for me to catch up. So now we're running next to each other. I tried my best to be polite, but he was making weird remarks like, "Oh, you're so skinny. Why don't you come over to my place and we can grab a bite somewhere?" and things like that. I repeatedly denied his requests, and finally he slowed down and grabbed my arm as I walked past. He then gave me a kiss on the cheek and ran away like a giddy child. Now, I don't know who this man was to this day, but I was freaked out to go on runs alone for months. Now, my grandmother lives alone just a few streets away from us. Unfortunately though, this year, due to COVID, she wasn't able to be round at ours like she normally would, so instead rung in the year by herself, watching the TV until around 12:30, when she then went to bed. About half an hour later, just as she was dozing off, the doorbell rang. She wondered who it could be. All her elderly friends who lived on the same street knew she would be in bed, so it couldn't have been them. And she knew it wouldn't be us, since no one is allowed due to our country's current lockdown rules. So she decided to just ignore it and try to get to sleep. A few moments pass by and the bell rings again, but this time they keep their finger on the bell continuously, so now she has to get up. She opens the inside door leading to the porch, but not the main door, and simply shouts, "Happy New Year," with no reply. So she goes to the front room window, draws back the curtains and looks out. There are two people standing there. A young boy around 12, holding a torch, and an older woman, who presumably is the boy's mother. My grandmother waves at them and says hello, but they don't respond. "Is everything all right?" she asks again, but still no response. "Well, you're not coming in, so bye." And with that she shut the curtains and went to bed. She didn't sleep much after that, and they were gone by the morning. Honestly, if that was me, I would have been terrified, and I probably would have been stupid enough to open the door and let them in. They may well have been harmless visitors wishing a Happy New Year, but coming to an elderly lady's house at 1 a.m. and not say a word, something is really off about it all. So this is something I've been thinking about a lot lately. It happened when I was living in New York City, working as a dominatrix out of a den. It was around Christmas last year, and I had just had 2 of the worst weeks money-wise, and was seriously about to lose my mind trying to figure out how to pay my bills. I'm pretty spiritual, and had been trying to manifest some money. But anyway, by the end of my shift I had seen 0 clients, and was feeling like crap, when suddenly a call came specifically for me. It wasn't uncommon for someone to see my pictures on the site and ask to meet me specifically, but this person was very insistent. He didn't want anyone else. So I got ready, and I'm already feeling a little weird about it, but I figured it may just be the fact that I really wanted it to be a good session, since he only wanted me. The guy showed up and I entered the room. He chose our pink room and had turned down the lights. He was just an average-looking guy, short brown hair and big, glossy eyes. He was sitting in the corner of the couch waiting for me. Now I found this odd, as guys are usually high energy, pacing or getting undressed by this point, but he was just calmly sitting there. I started with my usual stuff, when he stopped me and asked me to just sit down with him. So I sat on the other end of the couch and we started to talk. Suddenly he pulled out $300 and throws it towards me, telling me he hadn't been to my particular den in a year, but something called him to it tonight. He said he'd seen my picture and knew he had to see me. I was shocked. $300 was more than I'd made all in the last 2 weeks, and it helped a lot. I almost started to cry. I told him he had no idea what he had just done for me, and how badly I needed it. He was also pretty spiritual, so we figured it was just the universe doing its thing. We basically just spent the rest of the 1-hour session talking. He never attempted to undress or undress me. He just asked me about the movies I liked, showed me videos on his phone, and tried to get to know me. It was really nice. By the end of the hour, he asked to extend another 2 hours, but it was already 1 a.m. by this point, so I said we could just do 1. I went out, and my pimp, for lack of a better term, collected, and I went back in. The energy shifted in this next hour, and when I went back, the room was darker than the first time, and he'd requested towels and oil. He was also standing now, and had the towels on the couch. He said he wanted to massage me because he could feel my stress. I said okay. I trusted him a little more than the other usual clients. He asked me to undress this time, although it felt weird, because he was so adamant about me just being me in the first hour. Now he wanted me to be sexual. It was just a weird energy switch, but hey, that was my job, so I got naked. He started massaging me, and he started to say things that caught me off guard, things about me, things about my childhood that he couldn't have known. He told me he was a medium, and he felt called to me tonight. He'd seen my pictures, and he knew he had to deliver this message. He told me that I was surrounded by evil at this place, and that I was good, that people would hurt me here. He was basically saying that I was somewhere I didn't belong. It felt a bit sex-shamey. Then he started to tell me about him. He was a private financial analyst of some sort. Kept going on about how people who doubted him and made fun of him now relied on him. How he has his own plane and private license. He was loaded and all that. He went on to say that he wanted me to see him outside of the den, as he was going to help me. He kept pushing for me to give him my number, go to his house and go on his plane. He kept telling me he would give me all the money I needed, and how he would take care of me. At that point, the massage started to get more and more sexual. His eyes looked more glossy than they did before, and he started whispering, closing his eyes and rubbing my breasts. He whispered that I was good and that I deserved better, that he wanted to save me. My gut was screaming at this point, and I was crying now because I was so scared. There was something seriously wrong with this man. Now, I'm a big fan of true crime. I know all about these men who want to save sex workers. I knew that if I ever were to meet the man outside of this den, I would likely die. But he wouldn't take no for an answer. He just kept insisting that I meet with him outside of this place. He wanted to drive me home that night and kept begging for my number, said he would get more money. I told him he could give me his number, to which he immediately refused, then gave me an email from a heavily encrypted server. He still wouldn't back down. He was telling me how we were the same and how the universe brought us together for a reason. How else would he have known he needed to see me and bring me that money, or known so much about my childhood trauma? He kept saying my dummy name, and how can I not trust him? Don't you feel it? He said. He insisted we were soulmates and destined to be together. Everything he was saying was feeling very manipulative. He then said something that still sticks out to me now, about how we'd suffered the same childhood trauma, how a man had taken our innocence and hurt us badly. Then he went into this almost dazed and weird mumbling state where he just kept saying, I hurt him, I had to do it, he would do it again, I had to do it. And then went on to say that he fixed his problem and has lived on his own since. It was very scary and strange, and as soon as my timer went off for that last hour, I got the hell out. My pimp went back and said that he was insisting I come back for another hour, but I refused. I couldn't stand even the thought of being in that room a second longer. Anyway, I got my money that night and got out. About 2 weeks later I quit the den and never went back, and I thankfully never heard from him again. Something still feels off, so off about that night and him. I'm so grateful for the money, but there was something very, very wrong there. Before I left, I told the girls about it, and one girl remembered him. He used to come in for just one girl a year before, and he would have therapy sessions with her and try to do the same thing to her. I believe she ended up leaving because of his offer, and the other girls lost track of her and nobody knew where she was or what she was up to, which isn't uncommon, as a lot of us didn't even know each other's real names. So I have no idea how that worked out for her. I'm just glad I never went anywhere with him. There was something very disturbing about his energy, something you just have to feel to understand. When I was 19, I was a Marine and had stupidly used my military perks to get a home loan and bought my first house. I moved a barracks room worth of stuff into this place that seemed to me like a palace. Of course I went out and bought some bar stools, a futon to sleep on until I got a bed, and some used coffee tables for my TV. I also had my dog with me. I was unpacking my meagre belongings in the living room when I noticed a car had pulled into my drive and blocked me in. I walked out and there stood a man offering to sell me a home security system. The man was dressed in khakis and a polo with a name tag that I can't recall, and the car didn't have a logo on it either. It should have been a red flag for me, but I figured that some people on the job didn't drive company vehicles. He gave me his card. I don't even remember the company he told me he was with, to be honest. Then cue the friendly salesman, giving me his pitch about needing a system and all of the perks that would come with being able to watch the exterior of my house at any time. As a low-ranking military member, I knew I couldn't afford yet another thing, so my mind was working to try to get this man to go away. I even considered ninja chopping him, or whatever it is that we Marines do in hand-to-hand, just to get him to leave. But I'm a sort of passive person. I'm too nice. Nah, let's call it polite. I won't be rude to someone doing their job. I've been in customer service, so I can relate. I tried politely declining his offer, after he had tried to show me some stuff on his iPad, but you know how persistent these types can be. I'll admit to my own stupidity when answering his questions, like giving out too much information. Do you live alone? No, I live here with my wife and our 3 large dogs. At least I added in the large part. Her and her dogs hadn't actually moved in yet, and hers were just fat, though they were more vicious than my own good boy. But 2 women living together probably seemed like easier targets. I also mentioned being a Marine when he asked. He had seemed a bit shocked, but wouldn't be deterred. What kind of security system do you have? My dogs and me. Not the best answer I could have given. I wasn't exactly intimidating. I mean, I would be terrifying if I had a gun or something. I've been using them all my life, and I've never missed a target, alive or inanimate. If you invite me in, I can show you the best places to set up cameras, he mentioned more than a few times. Each time, he made me feel more and more creeped out, thinking that he was wanting to potentially rob me. Not that there was much to take. But despite being a sexual assault victim, all I could consider was a possible burglary. I made sure we stayed away from my house while we talked. We were outside for about 15 minutes in total, me spending most of that time trying to politely get away from him and retreat inside. I wound up at my wit's end with social niceties and just walked away, leaving him standing alone in my front yard. I walked into my house and locked the door. He got into his car and left, and I thought nothing more of it. After some unpacking, I couldn't do much, I had nowhere to put most of it. I ate some junk food and put together the futon. I got it all decked out with my fluffiest blankets, made sure the doors and windows were locked, and went to lay down in the living room. Looking back, I'm not sure why I didn't put it in the bedroom, as they all have blinds, and the rooms take a bit of getting to, but perhaps I wanted to just be near an exit. For some context, my back door is a double-glassed pane door. At the time, I didn't have curtains on it, but I did have blinds on the kitchen window, My kitchen, living room and dining room are all connected, but there's a wall in the living room that I strategically situated my futon against so it couldn't be seen by the back doors or the front door window. Call me paranoid. I had been laying down for a few hours, and at about 11, my dog got off the futon and went to the back doors. Now my dog is large and looks like a Rottweiler in colouring. He's a coon-hound mix, but I guess city people don't have hunting dogs. But he's never hurt anything in his life. He'll greet strangers at the door with a tail wag and hardly barks. But he stood back there for a bit and whined a few times. I ignored him, it was probably a squirrel. But then he started growling, a sound that I'll never forget. It sent terror straight through me as I sat alone in the dark. I had only ever felt that fear once, when a mountain lion screamed and I realized I was powerless against nature. But that's a story for a different thread. The point is, these sounds are designed to scare you, and it petrified me. I was frozen and wanted to wimp out, to hide, to call the cops, but I realized if someone was out there, they'd for sure see my phone light and know where I was. So while my dog stayed stationed at the back door, I talked myself up just enough to move off the couch and investigate, still scared out of my mind. I slunk to the kitchen and grabbed a kitchen knife, one of the only utensils I had, thanks Ma, and crept to the kitchen window. I was squatting amongst the cabinets so that I couldn't be seen from any windows, and bouncing a little, trying to gear up to peel back the blinds. My brain was telling me irrational things, horror stories that I had read come to life. But to be real, I was ready to bitch out. I'm not a brave person. I was in communications, for goodness sake. Pretty far from any life-threatening situation. Well, not one that involves people at my house, in my one safe space, my hideout, my protection from anything outside wanting in. I've always been afraid of home invasion. It stems from an incident when I was younger that isn't really worth mentioning further. But the point is, if someone dares to enter my safe space, it's not safe anymore. I thought I couldn't get more scared in that moment. But when I saw a male figure in my backyard, my heart jumped. He wasn't very far from the window I was looking out of. He was bold enough not to wear anything over his head, and I saw the blonde hair in the moonlight. It only took me a few seconds to recognize the security salesman in the dark. He was on the edge of my porch, watching my back door, and watching my dog. I jumped up quickly, climbed over the bar counter, and turned on the lights as I went towards the back door to let my still growling dog out, in hopes that he'd at least get rid of the man, if not injure him. But no dice. As soon as the lights came on, he had just enough time to jump the low part of the fence to safety before my dog even got off the porch. I didn't sleep that night. My dog sat on the futon with me, calm as could be, having done his job, and the next morning I filed a police report. But I couldn't tell them his name or what company he was with, having lost the card he gave me. They sent some patrols through the area, and I found out that all legit salesmen should have an ID upon request. That night I had 2 friends stay with me, ready for him to come back to either A, try to rob me or commit more nefarious acts, or B, try to scare me into home security. But he didn't come back, and I haven't seen him since. My dog hasn't growled like that since either, but I'm terrified for the next time that I hear it. Like many teenagers, my friends and I engaged in many activities that left us shaking our heads in embarrassment as adults. Nothing intentionally malicious, but undoubtedly stupid and reckless. One of those said activities was called rooting. We would drive to rural roads outside of town where we knew we wouldn't see anyone, listen to music and smoke weed. It was moronic and dangerous, but being young and stupid, we always enjoyed listening to new music and having a few laughs. One late night after we'd finished our route, we pulled into a gas station to grab snacks and fill up the tank. Nothing appeared amiss when we left, but I quickly noticed that there was now a man on a motorcycle behind us. It was a crotch rocket. At first I think nothing of it, but I found it strange that he wasn't passing us, given it was a 2-lane highway and there was no one else on the road. After a while, I started noticing he is appearing to make hand gestures towards our car, and I'm starting to get concerned. But because we are moving, I can't make out the gestures he is making. I alert my two friends, Rob and Mike, of the situation. Rob, who is driving, calmly responds that he noticed the man on the crotch rocket as well, and he thinks he is following us. The man on the crotch rocket was also wearing a helmet, so we couldn't see his face at all. To test our hypothesis, we start turning into different neighborhoods, and sure enough, he keeps following us. This is when it gets unnerving. We had to stop numerous times at stoplights and stop signs because, frankly, we were riding dirty and we didn't want to get pulled over. Every time we would stop, he would make hand gestures. At first, the man on the crotch rocket would just stare at us and point. Then it was pointing at us and sliding his finger across his throat. Then it was pointing at us and acting like he was shooting us, one by one. We debated confronting him, but my fear was if he did have a gun, we wouldn't stand a chance. We also debated calling the cops, but as stated earlier, we didn't want to get in trouble for our own activities. Eventually we decided to take him through the worst part of a nearby city, and it's a bad place to be. And after a few blocks he finally broke away. The whole ordeal likely lasted just under an hour, and to this day we are not entirely sure why he decided to harass 3 athletic young men, but we do know that he wouldn't do so if he wasn't up to the fight, which was a scary realization. So this is hardly as terrifying as some of the stories I've read on here, and I apologize if it's anticlimactic, but it's been on my mind lately, even though it happened years ago when I was 18. I told my friends who found it hilarious, but I just thought it highlighted how raising young girls to always be unfalteringly compliant and polite to their elders isn't necessarily always a good thing. I'm a woman in my mid-20s now, living on a farm in rural England, and I like to go jogging around the local area, especially along a nice 5-kilometre stretch of canal. This was the only time I ever had a creepy experience, and thankfully, or perhaps foolishly, it didn't deter me from running my favourite route after the incident. Perhaps I should also preface this by saying that I have zero street smarts. None. Zilch. I've lived in the countryside my entire life, and while it has its own dangers and shortcomings, the worst I've really had to deal with are people trespassing on the farm who are terribly British and usually move along without too much fuss, and everyone, including myself, apologising for being an inconvenience. So far, I think I've just been extremely lucky in that I haven't encountered anyone especially nasty. Touch wood. Anyway, before I go off on a tangent, I remember that it was raining on this particular day because I was really struggling not to slip in the mud and go straight into the canal. I must have been about 30 minutes into the run when I noticed a man fishing up ahead. Now, I've always loved fishing, and as I was jogging past him, his head snapped up, I assume because he didn't hear me approaching on account of the rain, and I shot him a smile and a wave, as I usually do to the people who I pass by on a run. I didn't really notice anything weird about him. He was just some old gentleman in a green raincoat looking startled by a jogger. But literally a second later, I tripped over his spare rod. Not a euphemism, I promise. It was just laying in the grass, and I wasn't watching my feet for a split second. But luckily I didn't fall flat on my face. I just stumbled a bit. I can't remember what he said that got me to stop, but it was something like, "Whoa, are you alright?" Maybe it's testament to how unfit I was at the time, but I actually welcomed the excuse to stop and catch my breath, so I turned around and said, "Oh God, don't worry, I'm fine. Just clumsy." Now, writing this out, I'm starting to see how there were about 1,000 things I could have done to avoid the situation. I think I opened a window to conversation by asking him what he's catching, if he's having a successful day, enjoying the weather, etc. We got to talking and he was perfectly pleasant, mentioning how he was retired, fishing was his hobby, and this was his first time in the area. I did notice that every now and again his eyes kept wandering down to my legs. But frankly, if I'm talking to someone, my gaze often flits around without me realizing I'm doing it, so I didn't think too much of it. Then he started to tell me about his wife had left him. An out-of-the-blue statement. I mean, we were literally just talking about how annoying crayfish can be for fishermen, but never mind. I offered my condolences, and he presses on about how his kids don't ever see him. He's lonely, and doesn't have a lot of joy in his life. He sort of pauses at this point and asks if I have a partner. I honest to God say no, and make a joke about reeling one in someday, but he didn't laugh. I have to be real with you guys. I didn't see a thing wrong with his odd line of questioning. No red flags popped up at all. But hindsight really is a wonderful thing, I suppose. The old man does that thing where he starts listing off reasons why I should have a boyfriend. Any man would be lucky to have me, blah blah blah. I'm so nice and articulate. How am I single? And at last, at long last, I falter. But I think it had more to do with the fact that I've always been awful at receiving compliments gracefully. I just go a bit shy and start to make jokes. So I said I'm most likely still single because I'm a terrible cook, and he immediately counters with I happened to be a chef when I was a young man. We'd be the perfect couple. Ah, I thought. He then offered me some sweet corn he'd cooked himself, the same sweet corn I'd been watching him use as bait for the last 10 minutes. At that point, he had me on the retreat. I wasn't scared of him, just a bit put out that a seemingly harmless conversation had taken such an unwanted turn. So, thank God I actually had some semblance of a brain in there. I declined the offer for waterlogged sweet corn bait and mentioned that I was expected home soon for lunch. He asked if I lived in the village up the road. Duh, it's the only damn village for miles. What could I say but yes? I waved and said goodbye, but before I could leave, he reached out and took my hand, saying, "Before you go, you've been so kind stopping to chat with me. Not everyone would do that. Would you mind if I asked for a kiss before you leave?" And this is the part of the story where my poor, suffering mother buries her face in her hands and asks me what in the world went through my tiny brain at that moment. I say, "Okay." I didn't want to. I didn't like the question. But the way I figured, we always kiss our elderly relatives on the cheek, either as a hello or goodbye. I thought he meant just that, a kiss in parting. Not an altogether weird thing to do in the UK. Admittedly odd to do with a perfect stranger, but I was always raised to be as accommodating as possible. I wouldn't say boo to a goose because if I ever raised my voice as a child, I was swiftly admonished for behaving so childishly. I love my parents deeply and unequivocally, but I wish they'd taught me to say no a little more often, and more so to say no without feeling guilty about it afterwards. So he stood up and I leaned around him, ready to press my cheek against his. And this old man grabs my chin and jerks my face forward, so I literally crash into his face, and he sort of just sucks at my bottom lip for all of a second before I immediately lurched back and stare at him like I didn't walk myself right into that. On a side note, I noticed there was some white stuff gathered on the corner of his lips, and I couldn't help myself. I gagged, rudely and loudly. He actually looked offended at that, but I didn't stick around to ponder on that sort of hypocrisy. Stammering something about hoping he enjoys the rest of his day, I pelted it along the canal, when I heard him call out, "Where are you going?" as if my hasty retreat was a complete mystery to him. I got home and instantly told my mum, expecting her to laugh it off with me, because what the hell, right? But she was righteously furious and lectured me on how I should have just said no in the first place. I didn't feel like debating the irony of her telling me that. She then made me promise not to go running along that stretch of canal again. I kept that promise for about a week. I got good marks at school, but that doesn't mean I'm smart. Luckily, I never did see him again, and frankly, I hope I never will. So that's it, a disappointing end, and I apologize for that, but I've been meaning to write this down for a while now, and if nothing else, I hope it at least serves as a cautionary tale for people like me who might be reading this, who aren't too proud to admit that they'd have probably reacted in a similar way, because being seen as rude is apparently more mortifying than being taken advantage of. But for goodness sake, if nobody else has told you this, because God knows nobody told me until much later in life, It is absolutely okay to say no to things you really don't want to do. For context, my family owns a small-ish apartment building. It has 5 apartments, and we live in a house in the back. My family has always been really interested in wildlife and animals, so we often set up motion-activated trail cameras around the woods or around a little kiddie pool that we have suspected foxes of drinking from. We'd been setting up the camera by the pool for a couple of days, and we'd all been excited in the morning to check the camera because there were a bunch of baby foxes that had been frequenting it. But what we found was really creepy. We got a few clips of foxes, but then we got a clip that was recorded at 3 a.m. of this fat man in a hoodie walking around our apartment building, looking in windows. My dad took the footage to the police station, that's literally right around the corner from our house, and they said they'd start patrolling our street more frequently. Something that really bugged me about it, though, was that there'd been a lot of other strange things happening lately. Now, my dog, who's extremely sweet but also super protective, would start barking almost every night at around 3 to 4 a.m. That had happened before, but it would always just be a raccoon or something that we'd shine a flashlight at, and they'd scurry off. But these barks were so consistently within that time frame, we were so confused, because we'd also never see any animals when we'd shine a flashlight out. Another odd thing is one of our tenants who lived on the 2nd floor, which is maybe 20 feet off the ground but has a balcony you can climb a fire escape to get to, had told us a few days earlier that she hadn't been able to sleep for the past week because she felt like something was watching her, and it was also around the time frame of 3 to 4 a.m. She even requested to move apartments, which we let her. So then after we gave the footage to the cops, about 3 days went by and nothing. No arrests, no new footage, nothing. But then one night my dad was taking my dog for a walk at around 11, so she doesn't have to go out late at night. And he's just about to get back to the house when he sees someone in a hoodie walking off the apartment porch. The hoodie was especially unusual because it was around 85 degrees in the middle of summer. The man looked directly at my dad and just stared at him, not scared, just staring directly into the light of my dad's flashlight. The guy then got in his car and didn't turn it on or drive off. He just sat there, staring directly ahead. My dad, who's sure it's him, gets his license plate number and walks around the corner to the police and gives it to them, and by the time they get there, he's gone. A few days after that, my dad, my brother and I are playing frisbee with my dog in the backyard, when my mum comes around and tells us she's seen someone who she thinks is the guy, looking directly at the house, like he's scoping it out. I grab a baseball bat and sprint literally faster than I ever have around the corner to where I see him scoping out my neighbour's house, and I yell at him and hit the bat on a street sign, and that's when he ran off. Now he's fat, 35 to 40, bald and wearing blue pants. We hadn't seen his face on camera because his hood was up, but I've now seen him. I also see a car, the same model my dad had seen parked at the end of our street, with the lights on and the ignition running, despite it still being light out. I checked the license and it's one letter off from the one my dad had said. My dad thought it was LJO, but it was actually JJO. I tell my dad and he tells the police, but says by the time he got there, the car was gone. We don't know what happened and we can't peg him with anything other than trespassing, so the cops couldn't do much like track his plates, and we still don't know if anything happened. So there is this really creepy van in our town that has painted handprints all over both sides of the vehicle, which in my opinion makes it look odd, especially in its dingy, rusty condition. And I have spotted it at many parks I have taken my kids to. It could be a coincidence, sure, but for about a year I have seen this vehicle parked in the lot of the soccer field on the outskirts of town, always in the furthest corner and under the trees which surround the place, and the guy is always just sitting there in the driver's seat. Now I walk past the park on a regular basis, and every time he is there, just sitting, which eliminated the possibility that he is walking his dog, as that is what most people do there. What is he doing there all day? The other day we were driving out that way, when we saw the van coming the other way. I pointed and said, "There he is," and no doubt coming from his roost at the park. My wife suddenly shrieks after catching a glimpse of his enormous, bulbous, pale visage, and I want to approach him just to see what he looks like, although there may be repercussions for such behaviour. Does he ever work, as it is a work van, as the term odd jobs implies? Whose handprints are on the van? His victims? I just want to know why he is always there, and what or who he is waiting for. I am not making this up. There is also a rusty, decrepit old school bus which drives around town too, all beat up with the letters S and H scratched off the word school to make it the cool bus. I noticed it one morning and decided to follow it a little. After driving behind it for a while, it merged into the left lane and put on its left turn signal. I approach and do the same. Suddenly it lurches to the right, making its turn in that direction. I turn left, not wanting to be obvious, but quickly turn around, trying to catch up to it, when I see him coming towards me and then past me. Obviously it shook me, as he was now going his original intended way. Another time I was behind it and I took pictures. I saw hooks dangling from the ceiling inside. He merged into our lane, suddenly running us out of ours and causing us to almost crash into each other. I suggested we follow, but my wife and kids wisely convinced me that that was a bad idea. Who or what are these psychos? Nothing I can think of makes this feel anything but sinister and strange. I think the bus cruises around in the morning, trying to trick children into thinking his is their school bus. But wherever he wants to take them, it most certainly isn't school. Hey there, it's me again, Miss Fearsome. I hope you enjoyed my video. If you did, then please hit that subscribe button. And if you'd like to support me further, please check out my Patreon and sign up for as little as $1 a month. Also, check out my new YouTube membership levels with some exclusive perks. So until next time, stay happy, stay safe, and remember, keep being creepy.